Hi, my name is Kayla,
Hi, my name is Ariana.
and today we'll be talking about the environmental movement and how protests bring about change. So, Ariana, what was the environmental protest movement and how did it originate?
So, the environmental protest movement was basically a political movement that was introduced by Rachel Carson, who was an author and a marine biologist. And after Rachel introduced this highly controversial movement, many people started to doubt their previous knowledge on pesticides and chemicals and the effects of them.
Well, if people began to doubt their previous knowledge of pesticides, how was pesticides viewed before Rachel Carson introduced her new theories?
Um, Before Rachel Carson introduced her new theories, many people had initially thought that the chemicals were really safe because the companies that sold the pesticides and chemicals were basically the only organizations coming out with scientific statements that backed up their products.
So then what was the turning point for people to stop believing these companies?
So then, after Carson's theories took popularity, people started to realize the damage they were causing when using pesticides and other chemicals that harm the environment. So then, throughout the next 3 decades, the movement created mass demonstrations and protests, which ended up changing the way people perceived the environment and how people took care of it. And as a result, environmentalism turned out to be one of the most powerful movements in the country and in the world. So, now that we've established an understanding on the protests itself, who were some people, important people, during the environmental protest movement that influenced the way people thought about pesticides and chemicals?
Well, during the time of the environmental protest movement, there were several influential figures who helped guide the U.S. to be more socially aware. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist working in Pennsylvania, and in 1962 she published a book titled Silent Spring. This book explored the harmful effects usage of pesticides had on both the planet and humans. This book opened many Americans' minds and led them to question their actions as well as companies and the government's actions.
That's true. And also, ecologists played a huge role during the movement. Aldo Leopold, who was a naturalist and an ecologist, argued that people had the utmost responsibility to maintain nature and to preserve it just the way it was. As a result, many ecologists were funded by the government and universities to continue their studies and research and to make everyone aware of the problems humans face in the world, even when after 1945 the study of ecology gained immense popularity.
How were people's health affected by new surfacing knowledge of chemicals and pesticides?
So, Rachel Carson wrote in her book, Silent Spring, about the horrid effect chemicals had on people and, more importantly, newborns. And this was eventually backed by a study done by the Environmental Working Group, which found 287 chemicals in newborns' umbilical cord blood. Children were very vulnerable to chemical exposures, and the timing of chemical exposures in children were super crucial. The chemicals have also affected the health problems of many people, such as diabetes and obesity. Chemicals are also found in our food and water supply, which has now become very common and uncontrollable.
An example of this, that is actually the cause of the creation for the first Earth Day celebration, is the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor incident. What happened was a small valve containing cold water that was connected to the power plant's reactor core burst open and allowed the water to escape, ultimately resulting in the reactor melting. This released nuclear chemicals into the atmosphere and resulted in neighboring towns and cities to evacuate. While this was a close call, if nearby citizens hadn't been evacuated on time, they would have suffered major health defects.
Yeah, and also this accident caused President Nixon to sign a new act, which became a law, to help save the environment and the living air and water and to keep it pure. So, Kayla, what were some of the laws and acts that were passed by Congress and Nixon, and how did they contribute to the movement?
Well, in the 70s, during President Nixon's term, he began to hear U.S. citizens' outcry for change and began passing federal pollution programs. These programs were formed from pre existing federal programs but had a clear and set focus on environmental factors.
True. And there were also new acts that were signed and passed by Nixon and Congress, respectively, when environmentalism became part of public policy. In 1970, Congress passed and Nixon signed the National Environmental Protection Act, which created a new agency and helped to enforce anti pollution standards for businesses and consumers. After the Protection Act was put in effect by Congress and Nixon, two new acts were passed in 1970 and 1972, which were the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, respectively.
And actually, all of these acts are still in effect today, and they have definitely helped the environment.
Yeah, and while they have helped the environment, it unfortunately just wasn't enough to make too big of an impact.
What societal changes did these policies bring?
These policies ultimately made people more aware of the consequences their action had on the environment. So, environmentalism slowly became more accepted and was integrated into school curriculums, and politicians also came together, even from the opposing side, to endorse environmentalism. Since environmentalism was accepted into American culture, Earth Day has now been adopted as a national holiday where people learn about the state of the environment and how they individually can help make positive changes.
Yes, that is true, but unfortunately, the chemicals that were deemed destructive to humans and to the environment had no policy change. Even though Rachel Carson's book was a huge success that triggered the environmentalism movement, the US never passed a Toxic Substances Control Act in order to regulate chemicals. And to this day, chemicals haven't been regulated yet. And on the societal side of things, many people in our society tend to ignore problems that have slowly arisen and instead they wait until the problem is no longer avoidable and then they decide to act upon it. But sometimes it is too late and the destruction has already occurred. Rachel Carson helped break previous societal norms, which helped people have an open mind and acceptance to new research.
So, before the groundbreaking environmental movement that Rachel Carson inspired, what were the previous societal beliefs and norms about the environment?
So, until the mid 1950s, many people who consider themselves as environmentalists had their morals set more on aesthetic or moral grounds. And they also strongly believed that the purpose of preserving nature was for it to remain beautiful.
But after the 50s, the mid 1950s, scientists began creating a new rationale for environmentalism called ecology, which is a scientific study of the interrelatedness of nature.
So, in conclusion, what did we learn today about policies and societal changes?
Well, I definitely learned that the start of the environmental movement had initially caused a lot of backlash due to previous societal beliefs and norms, which is interesting because now um, the environmental movement is widely accepted by most of the world.
I completely agree. At first, it seemed the environmental movement might be rejected from the initial amount of hatred and confusion it received. But I'm glad people were willing to have an open mindset and take this movement seriously. Because if they hadn't then, we definitely wouldn't now.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you learned something new today about our society and about the environment, and about all the processes and hardships that Americans went through.
Yes, thank you. That's all for today.